Now, when I was a kid, my church would have testimony services. And at a testimony service, the pastor would give up the pulpit and allow members of the congregation to share their testimonies, their stories of God's activity in their lives. I would hear stories of addicts sharing about miraculous, instantaneous ends to years of addiction. Cancer patients would recount going to the hospital for routine scans, only to learn that the doctors could no longer find the tumor that had once threatened their life. My favorites were the ones where parents would talk about the times they opened their mailbox and discovered an unexpected check for thousands of dollars. As I always left worship hopeful that I too would go home and find thousands of dollars in my mailbox. These stories were captivating and inspiring, and they were also remarkably demoralizing. You see, as incredible as these testimonies were, I was often left wondering why nothing like that ever happened to me. I couldn't shake the feeling that in order for my story to qualify as a testimony, it had to be just as sensational as the testimonies that I heard during worship. And eventually, the pressure to have a sensational testimony became so intense that I just started making things up. So once, I had broken the growth plate in my ankle. And after a prayer service at church, I whipped off my ankle brace and announced to the congregation that I was healed. And then I went to the doctor for my x-rays, and I was very much not healed. Another time, I shared a vision of myself becoming the pastor of our church one day. Now, the jury's still out on that one. It might happen at some point in the future, but I do sincerely doubt it because I did not, in fact, have any vision of the future at all. Now, odds are that most of you did not experience this level of spiritual pressure as a child. At least I certainly hope that you did not, and if you did, I'd be happy to have a conversation with you about that. But I do think that most of us know the struggle of feeling like we do not have a testimony, that we do not have a story about God's activity in our lives. And perhaps you feel that way because, like me, you are worried that your story is not exciting enough for anyone to care to listen. Or maybe you feel that way because you are worried that your story is too exciting, that there are too many moments of pain and trauma for any one person to handle. And then, of course, there is the added element of talking about God. On top of the fact that God talk often gets you weird looks nowadays, it's not always clear what counts as God's activity in our lives. And all of this makes knowing and sharing our testimonies a challenge. Now, if there was anyone in history who would have had a testimony worth sharing, it was Jesus. We don't even need to go through all of the 4 Gospels. We can just stick to what's happened thus far in the Gospel that Emily read from earlier, the Gospel of John. The text she read was from John chapter 8, and in the 7 chapters prior, Jesus has already turned water into wine, healed a child dying in Capernaum while he was 15 miles away in Cana, fed 5,000 people with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, and walked on water in the middle of a storm. And that is not the whole list. I took some parts out because I didn't want to read for 7 minutes. Jesus has done a lot. He's experienced a lot. And yet when Jesus was confronted by the Pharisees about his testimony, he didn't appeal to any of that. He didn't list out his miracles or stump the Pharisees with a riddle. Instead, Jesus simply said, "My testimony is valid because I know where I've come from and I know where I am going." Now, I love this moment from Jesus. I love it because it frees me from the need to have a jaw-dropping testimony. I just need to tell the story of where I've come from and where I am going. And when I do that, it becomes a lot easier for me to see God's activity in my life. So I don't need to have a growth plate in my ankle miraculously repair itself. I can just tell the story of how my friends sent me a box of donuts when my grandpa passed away, reminding me that I am loved not just by them, but by a God who is with me even in the midst of my grief. I don't need to see visions of a made-up future. I can just tell the story of how I was in my final year of seminary, wondering what was next for me, and a random phone call from a friend and a cup of coffee with a mentor helped me realize that I was being called to work with college students. Without them, I wouldn't be here at Press House. These stories aren't sensational, but they are testimonies, because they are stories about God's activity in my life. And I know that it's true that this was God's activity in my life because when I look back on those stories, I see that those moments pointed me toward peace, love, and justice. And that is what happens when God shows up in our lives. And I believe that sharing our testimonies, our stories of where we have come from, where we are going, and what God has done along the way is one of the ways that the world will know that we are Christians. Because our testimonies, even the ones that seem like they are not worth sharing, are a counter-narrative to the story that we hear so often about the world, that things are bad and only getting worse. You see, when we testify, we proclaim the good news that God really is active in the world, moving us and the world toward peace, love, and justice. This is news that we need to remember and to share with one another. And so today, I want us to practice testifying together. And so in a few moments, we're going to give you some time to think about a testimony, a story that you might have about God's activity in your life, a story that you might share with someone else. So on the screen, you will see 3 questions. Where have I come from? Where am I going? And how have I seen God at work in my life along the way? These questions are prompts to help you think about a testimony you might share. You don't have to stick to them, but they are guides for you. And on your tables, in your clusters, there are pens and index cards for you to write down any reflections if that feels right to you. So we'll take a few moments to think, and then I'll come back up and share instructions for the next part of our activity.